I found out about the ordination of Reverend Wade H. Mance, who is my great-great-grandfather, who I had no idea was an ordained reverend, but there is a documentation of my people's legacy and history. And so it is important for us to tell our stories, whether we do it through a diary, whether we do it through court pleadings, whether we do it in graffiti tags on the sides of buildings or in photographs, or arrest dockets, because we have resisted tyranny through civil disobedience. We've got to resist and we've got to tell the story, because freedom is not a finished sentence.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Old North Church. My name is Nikki Stewart. I'm the executive director of Old North Illuminated. Old North Illuminated is the nonprofit organization that manages interpretation, education, and preservation here at Old North Church. So at Old North Illuminated, we believe very much in presenting history that is for the people, which is history that is honest and complex. It is sometimes painful, sometimes inspiring, but always very relevant to our lives today. And so there are many things about Old North Church and its community throughout the centuries that our visitors are surprised by. But there are just a few things that I'd like to share as we think about our connections today between the past and the present. Now, the first is that Old North Church, almost from its origins in 1723, was a very racially diverse congregation, which to some extent matched the diversity of the town and then the city of Boston. And we're always careful to explain that that doesn't mean that this was a place of racial equality, but it was a place of racial diversity where people from different races and backgrounds and to some extent socioeconomic classes could connect with each other and could have a faith in common. Our visitors are also surprised to learn that Old North was not a patriot congregation. Old North is founded as a parish of the Church of England, and so, of course, loyalty to the king is very much part of the faith. And we always say that by the time of the Revolution, Old North is about a third loyalist, a third patriot, and a third that just still doesn't want to talk about politics at the Thanksgiving dinner table. Certainly something that we can all relate to today. But it was a community that was very politically divided, but still connected by their faith. And so, we think about folks coming here to worship in 1774, 1775, and sitting down to have, beautiful acts of community with people who felt very different from them. Probably at times that felt personal. Again, something that we all can relate to today. But what I think about in this context is that on the afternoon of the famous Tuaphysi lantern signal, the church's rector, Mather Biles Jr., resigned. And we think that's really an act of coincidence that the lantern signals would take place that night. But after that, the church was without a rector for several years. And so as a community, Old North had to go through a war without their church, without their spiritual guidance. And so I think that's a particularly difficult and painful way to think about experiencing the revolution. And of course, they didn't understand how things would turn out. We look back today and we know what the outcome was, but I think that they must have felt so unsure and afraid and felt the pressure of having to make decisions to keep their families safe, but not knowing what that would be. And so I think as we have our panel discussion tonight and think about what it means to be in precedented times, I think Old North Church is a very fitting place to have that conversation. And with that, I will turn the mic over to our poet.
I want to first and foremost thank Diane for inviting me this evening to be able to share this poem. I wrote this probably a couple of weeks ago, but it's so fitting, especially in this time that we're in. It's called Boston, Breathing Revolution. Boston is a body that learned how to breathe rebellion. 250 years ago, its lungs filled with harbor wind and exhaled insurrection. Men moved like midnight metaphors across the Massachusetts waterline, tea tumbling like trembling empires into a harbor that held the secret like a clenched fist. But revolution was never really about tea. It was about the tremor of people tired of swallowing silence. Boston has always had a mouth made for megaphones. Cobblestones still remember the rhythm of resistance, boots beating ballads into being, banners breathing into the bitter cold while courage climbed the courthouse steps. This city knows how protest becomes poetry, how pamphlets become prophecy, how a whisper becomes a wildfire of voices. Because history here does not sleep in textbooks. It walks, it marches, it moves through neighborhoods where grandmothers remember the long grammar of liberation, where children inherit courage, a family heirloom passed palm to palm. Boston is not just where a revolution began. It is where revolution kept learning new names. Abolition, suffrage, civil rights, labor lines, Black lives lifted like lanterns through long nights of injustice. Each generation gathering the courage the way the harbor gathers tide. Slow, steady, unstoppable. Because freedom here is not a finished sentence. It is a breath still being taken, a pulse still pushing through the arteries of a city that understands the past is not a museum. It is a mirror. And when Boston looks into it, 250 years later, the reflection still asks, who among you is brave enough to keep the revolution breathing? Thank you.
Thank you to everybody who's come out on this kind of dreary day to Old North. You're joining us for the very first ever Silence Dogood Precedented Times Town Hall series. So tonight is a bit of an experiment, so thank you for being part of this. We're combining conversations with expert historians and civil rights leaders and your submitted messages to come up with a culminating message for this moment. We decided to call this series the Precedented Times series because we kept hearing these are unprecedented times. Every headline seemed like it was saying unprecedented things, but there are many similarly dangerous, chaotic, paradigm-shifting moments in history that we can look back to and learn from. And especially in this commemorative 250th moment, it's an opportunity to understand our history a little bit better, to feel the stakes that maybe people were feeling 250 years ago, unfortunately, and then to better understand how these present circumstances came to be because of the past. So tonight we're looking specifically at Boston's role in resistance on the eve of American independence in the 18th century, and how we can carry that spirit on today. And to do that, we have a pretty awesome lineup of speakers. Carol Rose is the executive director of the ACLU of Massachusetts, a nonpartisan, member-supported organization that uses litigation, legislation, communications, and organizing to promote civil rights and defend civil liberties. Under her leadership, the ACLU of Massachusetts team secured the first in the nation equal marriage rights for LGBTQI couples. Get ready to clap a lot. They drafted and passed a post-Dobbs Shield law to protect providers and patients seeking abortion and gender-affirming care, litigated the precedent-setting case that ensures the right to record the police successfully challenged family separation and detention of immigrants under the first Trump administration, and won pre-trial release of more than 3,000 people incarcerated during the COVID pandemic. Pretty good. Then we have Rahsaan D, who serves as president and CEO of the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts, where he leads the historic 106-year-old organization dedicated to dismantling systemic barriers and advancing racial and economic equity across Eastern Massachusetts. Since assuming leadership in 2023, Hall has guided ULEM to expand its programming across its 5 core pillars: employment, education, health, housing, and justice. Kyera Singleton is the executive director of the Royall House and Slave Quarters Museum. As one of the only remaining freestanding quarters where enslaved people lived and worked in the North, the museum bears witness to their lives, to the intertwined stories of wealth and bondage in pre-revolutionary Massachusetts, and to the resistance and political and legal activism of enslaved and free Black people in the 18th century. She held a PhD from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor in the Department of American Culture, and she's postdoctoral fellow for the Slavery, Colonialism, and Their Legacies project at Tufts University. And last but not least, we have Jane Kamensky, who is president and CEO of Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. A leading historian of early America and the United States, she has worked for 3 decades as a professor and higher education leader, most recently as Jonathan Trumbull Professor of American History at Harvard University and Pforzheimer Foundation Director of the Schlesinger Library on the history of women in America at Harvard Radcliffe Institute. One more. She brings to her work at Monticello a strong sense of civic purpose and a commitment to the ways that rigorous scholarship and compelling, honest storytelling help to build citizen capacity and revitalize the American experiment. Now. Okay, I am so excited to get into some of these questions. Our first one is for Jane. We're gathered here in Old North Church, which had already been a congregation for a few decades here in Boston. Put us in this spot 250 years ago. What would it have been like to walk out these doors into the Boston of spring of 1776? Maybe we go 1775. And what's changed since the course of the decade?
So spring of 1776 is a really interesting place to begin because the action has left Boston and has substantially destroyed the town. So by April of 1776, the British, who were besieged here after the fighting at Lexington and Concord, have packed up, have headed some to New York, which they would occupy for the rest of the Revolution, some to Canada, taking enslaved and free Black people with them and leaving an enormous amount of destruction in their wake. Old North was substantially spared because it was principally a Loyalist congregation. Old South had been used as a stable, and pews and fences had been burned for wood. Supply lines were cut all over. I was walking here from a hotel on the waterfront and thinking all of these street names that indicated the economic connections of Boston, commercial and India for the West Indies trade. All of those connections had been severed by the war and the long siege, which punished Boston for its role in instigation, right? From 1763, from the end of the French and Indian War. This had been the place that had the mouth that the microphone was made for, as our poet said, the place that was unlike so many other colonies, but was so insistent in voicing a vision of American rights, British American rights, that it had eventually helped to forge a common cause of all, as people described the rebellion of 13 of Britain's 26 colonies. But in the spring of 1776, the place was pretty trashed. A huge population loss, 15,000 out of 18,000 people, something like that had left. So if we think about present-day connections, Boston has risen from the ashes a lot. And the eve of American independence, they knew it was the eve of American independence. Abigail Adams wrote her Remember the Ladies in the Code of Laws, I suppose that it must be necessary for you to make, anticipating independence on March 31st, 200 years and 19 days ago, not 20 days ago. So there's an incipience, but also just a complete chaos after the evacuation on March 17th. So Boston started it and paid for it and was in the process of making itself over anew.
So it was leading the fight for forms of self-government and equality, and it paid the price. But what kind of inequalities marked the city, Kyera? What promises of freedom were withheld and from whom?
Yeah, so it's a really great question. So I'm gonna just take us back a few years and start at 1773. And in 1773, what you see are that you're seeing an uptick in freedom petitions from enslaved people. In particular, there's a man named Felix Holbrook. And he, along with other enslaved men, are writing petitions and they're putting them into the general court. And they're essentially saying, we not only want our freedom in Boston, but throughout the Commonwealth. And it's really important for us to kind of grapple with that, because what it allows us to see is that there's always been this rich history of Black activism, and we often kind of overlook it just a bit, and we locate it in a conversation about the Revolution. But actually, it's starting at the beginning of the 18th century. And then you see that with the Revolution, enslaved and free Black people are using this as another moment to try to push, their causes forward. But you get those petitions starting in 1701, actually. And so I think when I think about someone like Felix Holbrook, what's really interesting is that petition goes in 1773. It just kind of languishes, actually, because Hancock and Adams have decided that they're going to pause the conversation on slavery. But a few months later, I think that petition goes in January. By April, they put another one in. And then Felix appears on petitions between 1773 and 1777. And so he keeps going. And you can see this rich history of organizing that's happening, that is often happening outside of the purview of the judges and the lawyers, but that is grounded in, a Black Boston, and a Black Boston that we often don't talk about or we don't readily see. And so I think that's really important to acknowledge, that Black people have always been their own political agents, and actually the court documents show us that.
Yeah, I think there's, I found this an interesting statistic, to go to some numbers, that Boston's population around the time of the Revolution was about 15,000, and then there were 4,000 British soldiers that came into town-ish. Okay, and that, I think that imagining what that ratio would have been like is sort of startling. And then also, Boston was about 10% Black at the time. Just to paint sort of a numbers picture for everybody. So Rahsaan, we've heard descriptions of a city wrestling with big concepts of freedom and self-determination and questions of who are we, where does our power come from, and people taking really dangerous risks to stand up to existing power structure and paying the price in some cases. So, do these descriptions of 18th century Boston evoke parallels to today? I hope you say yes, because otherwise this entire structure falls apart.
I have no idea what you're talking about. What do you mean?
And are there new challenges that maybe weren't around in the 18th century?
So there are certainly parallels that exist. We talk about the small, relatively small community that Boston was then. And within that proximity, there was exorbitant wealth and exorbitant lack. There were disparities in who had and who did not have, and it fell certainly along racial lines, but it also fell along lines of gender and class. And so that still continues. We're a stone's throw from Roxbury, where you have some of the shortest life expectancy in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. You have the lowest income levels within the Commonwealth in this hub of academic, intellectual, scientific exploration and leadership, but somehow it doesn't reach all of the people yet. And still another parallel is that you have Black people in positions of power, in leadership and education, in various fields, who are leading the charge for liberation, for freedom, then, also now. And so I think there's this thread that continues to run throughout Boston's history, the Commonwealth's history, that Black folks have always been here. And it's interesting because I was just watching, a reel on social media that was talking about Black Boston today, and how the narrative that exists of who Boston is, Ben Affleck and Matt Damon, who aren't even from Boston, like Cambridge. But you've got, you've got Donna Summers, or the New Edition, Bobby Brown, folks who, Malcolm X, these notable figures in history who are from Boston, who have been overlooked. And so Kyera's point about the snapshot of that revolutionary moment did not include, or the telling of that snapshot of the revolutionary moment did not include the telling of the story of Black people in Boston and our role, aside from Crispus Attucks, or folks like Phyllis Wheatley, but there were others who were consistently here petitioning for their freedom, pressing on the legislature, advocating in the courts, but also in the community. And that ran consistently. I mean, you think about even kind of post-18th century, the slave patrols that would come up and snatch people back. I'm thinking of Shadrach Minkins and Anthony Burns, who were self-emancipated Black folks who were brought back. Even in good old liberal, progressive Massachusetts, they still allowed that to happen. And you look at some of the ICE patrols that are happening now, where people are being snatched and removed. So there are some parallels that continue to exist. Certainly the passage of time and the passage of laws and the strengthening of community has led to more opportunities for people of color and Black people in particular. But the change of laws, where we're not faced with de jure segregation, but it's still very segregated here. So there's plenty of parallels that exist, and some unique opportunities, especially with the advent of technology, for us to kind of cast a vision of the future of the world that includes Black people.
I learned a crazy thing when I was researching this, that maybe people in Massachusetts already knew this, I'm new here, but the Indian Imprisonment Act of 1675, which said that Native people could not enter the town of Boston, was repealed in 2005. So history has a really long impact. Yes. It's very insidious. I want to go back to Jane. I grew up in Maryland. I lived along the East Coast. You're in Virginia now. Boston feels different from those places. Was that the case back in the 18th century? How was Boston unique among port cities?
So if you look at the world of the 18th century instead of backwards from the 21st, Boston and Massachusetts are remarkably equalitarian places for all their rank consciousness, right? In this church, you would have sat in the order of your wealth. Those pew numbers would have corresponded to your wealth. But there's more social mobility for white and for some free Black people in Massachusetts than there is anyplace else. Literacy is incredibly high, and I think if we're looking for a through line, it's voice that is outscale, frankly, to importance. It's voice that's outscale to economic contribution to the empire. It's voice that's outscale to size, Black as well as white. The Black population of Boston is smaller than you said. It's about 5%, right?
Okay.
Boston is enormously invested in enslavement, but its investment is mostly offshore. So slavery in Boston, with the exception of the Medford plantation of Isaac Royall, which Kyera interprets today, is a small-scale enterprise. You can look, there's a tax list from 1770 that is digitized and sortable as a spreadsheet. And most people are enslaved in groups of 1 or 2 or 3, 5 is large, which means that there's an enmeshment of rich and poor in Boston, and rich and poor are way closer together than they are in a Virginia or a South Carolina, let alone a Jamaica or a London. At the time of the Revolution, there are about 500,000 people enslaved in the colonies that become the United States. 200,000 of those live in Virginia. I don't think the number in Boston cracks 2,000. So what are the opportunities that you can seize in a place that is literate, that is committed to a hot variety of Protestantism, where the equality of all believers before God is something that's preached, even if it's not lived. I think it's no accident that anti-slavery thought among white people, anti-slavery thought among black people is there from as soon as there is enslavement anywhere, right? That's what self-liberation shows. But anti-slavery thought among white people, the first in the English-speaking world, is here also in 1701. So there's a kind of dynamism that is disproportionate to the economic might of the colony, and historians are really skeptical of these sort of cultural through lines, but the way in which Massachusetts remains the knowledge hub of the United States, right? There are more newspapers here in 1776 than every place else put together. That there's the first university. Some of that concentration of knowledge and the willingness to leverage it, I think, really is quite distinctive in the British colonial world.
Carol, it's time. In your experience organizing and advocating for civil rights, we hear that Boston has this sort of legacy of education and being a mouthpiece. Does that stand true today? What stands out about Boston, its responses and its challenges today?
No, first of all, it's such an honor to be here with these amazing, knowledgeable people. It's really an honor, and with you, it's great, and with all of you. When I think about why is Massachusetts, even today, feel like a place where we're more cutting edge when it comes to equal rights, to be sure, we have a long way to go. So I want to just acknowledge that and say that. And yet, it's better than many other places, even now. And I think there are a few things that feed into that. First of all, I think we have city and town government. So people are close to their cities and towns, right? We don't have county-based government as they do in much of the country. I think the fact that we have the John Adams Constitution, and John Adams is not a great historic figure, but the Constitution was really important. And even though that Constitution was written by, property, white enslavers and all those bad things, the principles that were put forth, because of the education system, because of the history of education, were heard by people. So Elizabeth Freeman, Mom Bet, she heard that and she sued for her freedom, right? Because she heard the words, she heard the principles that were there. And the same thing has gone throughout the Commonwealth. I think we see the people who heard it. So women heard it and said, we want to have equality too. And so the suffragette movement was very powerful here. And then gay people heard it and they said, we want to have equal rights too. And then they fought for equal rights. And by the way, we did it with GLAD law, so you know. It was a movement bringing equality. Interracial marriage, all of these things that came about because of the seeds that were planted at the time of the Revolution about equality and justice and due process. And the Fourth Amendment was James Otis, who argued the Fourth Amendment here in Massachusetts. And John Adams heard that and wrote the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So our Constitution is the oldest written Constitution in the country, but it's the basis for the U.S. Constitution. It's actually even better. But but it's the basis. And I think when people hear that, and that through line, as Jane talked about, becomes tremendously important, because people hear it and they say, yeah, it's not about who wrote it, it's about what the principles are. And so we apply those principles time and time and time again to every new generation, every new group that wants to have the same freedoms that all of us have. So I think that continues to guide us. And I also want to say, listening to the thoughts about education, you know, I think this is why this current administration in Washington is going after education, because they know that education is so fundamental to democracy. They know that education is the antidote to autocracy. And so I think it's so important that all of us rededicate ourselves to keeping Massachusetts and keeping education alive in America throughout the whole country, because that is the basis for actually making sure that everyone can learn their rights and can fight for their rights.
Do you feel like Massachusetts, oh yeah. Do you feel like Massachusetts is a leader? I'm hoping that we can be a leader on the sort of national stage of resistance.
Well, so the ACLU, so people think of the ACLU, we're in the courts, and we are. We see you in court. But we also have offices in all 50 states and Puerto Rico and District of Columbia. And so I have counterparts throughout. And let me tell you, their jobs, my counterpart, Bacardi Jackson in Florida, is doing hard work. Jarvis Dortch over in Mississippi, he's doing hard work. The work is much harder in those places. And so they look to Massachusetts and they say, thank you. Please push the envelope. Please continue to do the work, because we provide a model that people from other states can then, it's like a beacon, literally, which isn't to say that we have it right, because there's still so much inequality here, but it has gotten better. And the other thing I would just say, when I first came to Massachusetts in 1993, somebody said to me, isn't it great that we've broken through the ethnic divide with our new mayor, which was Tom Menino? And I was like, isn't he a white guy? And they said, yeah, but he's Italian, Italian-American instead of Irish-American. And I was like, wow, okay, that's crazy. But, and now look at our leaders. We have the first openly gay woman governor. We have in Maura Healey, we have Andrea Joy Campbell is a remarkable attorney general, here, who's an African-American woman. We have Ayanna Pressley. We have Michelle Wu as the mayor of Boston. I mean, even in the time period that I've lived in this town, which is now, 30 years, things have gotten so much better. And when you look at the structures of power, things have really changed and really gotten better. And that doesn't happen on its own. That happens because people are pushing for it to happen, are demanding that it happen, and are taking action and showing up to be sure that it happens.
Awesome. Kyera, maybe we can flip back to the 18th century and you can talk about some of those individuals that were pushing to make change happen, even when they didn't have political power.
So I think when I even hear the word political power, I think they did have some political power, maybe not formalized political power, but it is important to, think back to, these moments and understand that when Black people and Indigenous people are suing, they are pushing policy. Maybe it's not going to happen in that moment, but it will eventually happen. And so one person that I'll highlight is Belinda Sutton. Belinda Sutton was enslaved by Isaac Royall for 50 years, and when he absconds and leaves his plantation in Medford to go to Nova Scotia and then England, all of the enslaved people who were still on that plantation was like, all right, bye. Like, we're not staying here either, So they self-emancipate. We know that Belinda Sutton ends up in Boston, and when Isaac dies in 1781, in his will, he says, Belinda, you can either remain enslaved and be enslaved by one of my daughters, or you can be free. And she's already living her life as a free woman, so she's like, what? I'm gonna stay free, thank you. But then she goes, freedom is actually not enough. And why would she say freedom is not enough? Well, it's not like racism just disappeared. In fact, we know because of her petitions that she's not only struggling to feed herself, but to take care of her daughter. We know that the Royals are giving her money for rent and firewood to heat her home. So she is living in a precarious situation. We know that in one of her petitions, she says that she is literally dying of hunger. And so when we think of this moment and why these petitions matter, it's amazing that she puts this petition in, she gets reparations, the court agrees with her that she should not endure these conditions, but she only gets that payment twice, even though it's supposed to be annual. And then she keeps petitioning. And that's why we know so much information about her, because she keeps, dictating her story over and over and over and over again. And what it allows us to see is, while we celebrate Belinda, because it is incredible, it's amazing that we have this document from a Black woman in the 18th century. We do not have many of them. So this document is so important, and it is a victory. But when we only focus on the victory of it, we actually ignore the conditions that she's laying out, which shows that Black people are still struggling in the 18th century. They're struggling with employment, they're struggling with food security, they're struggling to really keep their families together. And if you look at the almshouse, it's one of the best ways to actually tell us what's going on in that period. You see that Black people and their entire families are entering into the workhouse in the 18th century. So are white families too, but Black people are staying a lot longer, and they're coming in and out because they are struggling. They're struggling with poverty in that moment. And so while you have this rich activism, you also have Black people saying, we do not deserve to live like this. It's not just about freedom, it's also about asking for basic rights and conditions in order for them to build a life. And then they're just building their world on their own because they can't rely on the government. So you get the African Meeting House, right? You get, education for Black people. You get Black preachers, and they're starting their own churches. They're basically taking social conditions into their own hands and saying, well, if you all won't do it, we will do it ourselves. And then what is more powerful than having a whole group of Black people who are literate and political, and if you're in Beacon Hill, you might even own your home. You're starting to form the base of an actual Black political coalition.
Amazing. Jane, when we hear about Boston resistance and organizing in the 18th century, we tend to hear about boycotts and property destruction and violence. But I'm particularly interested in this question. How were public art and anniversary festivals part of Bostonians' organizing work in the Revolutionary era?
It's a great question. So when we think about the road to the American Revolution, we tend to think that it goes like this, but it goes like this. And things go quiet for long periods of time. So one of the questions then as now for activists is, how do you sustain from headline to headline? And public art is a big part of that, of that strategy. So anniversary memorials, commemorations of the Boston Massacre, orations on the anniversary of the Boston Massacre, which start in 1771 and continue to this day. Illuminations in the windows of public buildings, prints like Revere's Bloody Massacre and the map that he does after the fact of the British landing in Boston, those troops in the fall of 1768, sort of keep this theme of a rebellion alive in the mind's eye at a moment when people are likely to reach a new punctuated equilibrium and think it's time to go home. I think the other really important sustaining node and broadening node is the press, which also features images. And the underside of what Carol is saying is Boston has been generally good to itself and increasingly good with a wider definition of what counts as itself. But the city's singularity made it really hard to build coalitional energy in other places, right? How does anybody come to care about Boston instead of it being like the head of the hydra that the king cuts off? And that involves the circulation of images. It involves building nodes of correspondence in other places and sharing strategy. And it involves a lot of compromise, right? So this is a place with perfectionist sensibilities from the very beginning of British settlement. When people from Boston and Massachusetts show up in Philadelphia in 1774 and then again in 1775, it's like a bunch of fanatics walking in, right? So we can clap for that, or we can think about what the edges are that need to be sanded down, or the hand of civic friendship that needs to be extended to have a greater chain of being. And I think either one can work, right? Separatism is a strategy. And it's worked very well in limited laboratories for groups that are minoritized in various ways. If you don't want to be the independent city-state of Boston, I don't think it's a sufficient strategy in this time.
Do you have any examples of public art or commemorative thing that happened in the 18th century that was particularly powerful?
Well, right up on Hanover Street, there was a destruction of the then Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson's house, which was not spasmodic crowd violence, but a kind of artistic happening, right? A symbolic decapitation. People talked about the feathers from his pillows sifting in the gutters down North Street, and the taking of the cupola off the house almost as if you were taking the king's crown or even the king's head.
Wow.
The hanging of effigies, right? The Liberty tree on the common, an elm tree that the British troops cut down, right? It was a symbolic enough gathering of, I know I'm blending art and ritual, but of artistic ritual, and they were funny. And I think that's one of the things that Silence Dogood has done really well, is to have that bite of satire, right? When they went after Lord Grenville and Lord Bute, they hung a green vial boot. And everybody, in a time where there's no First Amendment, right? And the mere fact of speaking against power in a British common law system can be illegal. It's seditious libel. Well, it doesn't say this is Grenville and Butte, it's a green vial boot. So there's a playfulness to some of it, and it's not art like you're walking into a museum and you have to know a grammar of being in an elite space. It's art that speaks up and down, and it's art making that happens up and down in a way that I think makes people feel like they're in on the joke.
Amazing. That's, I don't think we're that brave yet. We're not taking down cupolas yet.
Next week.
Next week. Yeah, we'll see how bad it has to get. Okay, so we've heard a lot about the 3.5% rule, Carol, recently, about how much of a population has to speak up for real change to happen. And sitting in this building, which is so well known for Paul Revere and his Midnight Ride, and we think about the network that was actually around Paul Revere. It was, Joseph Warren telling him the news that the British were on the move. It was, tell me their names, Robert Newman and Captain John Pulling Jr., who went up that tower and flashed the signals. It was William Dawes who took the other route. It was the guys on the boat that rowed him across. It was the person who met him with a horse, and then on and on and on. It was a massive network. How can we sort of find that network building? How can we build coalition and bridge divides to sort of come together and build momentum?
Well, it's so important. And one thing is, we're doing it here tonight because you all showed up, right? And that's what really matters, is showing up. And when you think about, the first No Kings had 1 million people. The second had 7 million. And the third, we just hit 8 million. And so the 3.5% rule is what some academics have said who've studied authoritarianism, that when you have democratic backsliding, if you can mobilize 3.5% of the population, it would be 12 million here, then you have a chance of overcoming the authoritarian threat. And so we're pushing for that, and it's just, and whether the number is exact or not, what matters is that people are showing up. And it's not just the people who showed up on the Common. There were more than 115, I think, cities and towns in Massachusetts that had a No Kings rally. People showed up, and it would be 15 people or 20 people or 400 or 300, and in some of those places it's even harder to show up, right? Because it might be a more conservative place and your neighbors know you, as opposed to in a big crowd. But showing up really makes a difference because it signals to the elected leaders that they need to be more brave, right? They pay attention. I remember right after Trump got reelected, I had a couple of the senators, both of them, say to me things like, "Where are the people? Why aren't they showing up?" Well, they are showing up, and they know that, and now they feel more brave. Same thing with the elected officials in the state legislature, and even the judges. It really matters when people show up. We take people to the courthouse with us because when a judge comes in and he sees a bunch of people there, they pay attention. They know that this case is really important. So showing up is really important to do. And that's why art is so important, because people will show up for art. People will show up for music, right? They'll build community through music. And we have to continue to do that. And we have to work in coalition. I mean, one of the best things that we've been doing lately is I work with Rahsaan all the time in coalition. We work with labor. We work with, student groups. We work with other civil rights groups. We work with businesses. We'll work with anybody. I'm like, if you're opposed to fascism, come in my tent. We have to build a broad coalition and set aside our differences, like we had to do at the time of the revolution, so that we can overcome this incredible threat. It's a really existential threat to our democracy and to our country. And then as we come together, we have to start to say, how can you build a democracy that works for everyone? Like if you say to a random person, "Oh, defend democracy." Well, why? If it's not working for me, why should I bother? We've been doing a really wonderful outreach, public education outreach. We're calling it BIPOC to the Ballot Box. And we're going into majority-minority communities around Massachusetts. We're in 5 now. And we hire local people to go door to door and to canvass. And we say, how come you haven't registered to vote, right? And you know what the number one reason is? My vote doesn't matter, right? But it does matter. And so that's why we have to go back, and we're going in, especially in school boards, town halls, those kinds of elections, not just the presidential elections, but from the ground up. And if we can build this from the ground up, using all the tools in our toolkit, whether it's law or organizing or art and education, I think we have an opportunity to hit that 3.5% and surpass it and really turn the tide and restore the democracy, or actually go forward to a democracy that might actually work for all people.
Thank you. Okay, this is my final question, and it's for Rahsaan.
Oh boy.
Boston was occupied by the British Army for 8 years, from 1768. Then it was under siege for about 11 months. Historians call me out if I'm wrong. And then the Revolutionary War went on for another 7. And then the struggle, as we've sort of all elaborated on, continues for many. I think that when we think about the revolutionary moment, especially in this moment, looking back, the sort of endurance is a piece of it that gets lost in the history telling, but it's so essential for making change. How can we find endurance and perseverance in this moment?
There's a rich legacy that exists in the experience of marginalized people. And I think if we look to people who society has excluded or oppressed, we're always going to be able to find inspiration. I am the president and CEO of a 107-year-old affiliate of a 113-year-old organization that came into the existence at the turn of the century to address the temporal concerns of Black people who moved north during the Great Migration, who were corralled into ghettoized communities and denied employment opportunities. And we are still doing that work. There have been many great advances that have been made, but there are still some of those very same issues that we are facing. I am an ordained reverend in a denomination that came into existence not because of a theological difference, but because Black people in Philadelphia at St. George's Methodist Church were forced to stay in the balcony, and when they came down for prayer, the white deacons said, "You can no longer pray here." And they said, "When we get up from this altar, we will never return again." And they started the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is the longest continually existing Black denomination in the nation. And so those experiences inform my perspective. I look at the civil rights movement. I look at the suffrage movement. I look at the LGBTQ movement. They are all long-term struggles and resilience and persistence that has continued. And when we think about the moment that we are in now and the machinations of a madman in the White House, he is not the problem. He is the manifestation of the problem that is weaved into this nation's fabric and identity. And for as much as we felt that we have gained some level of progress throughout history, whether it is through the laws or through business opportunities or because we're able to live next to one another or travel wherever we want, there is this consistent backlash. And so we have to stay ever vigilant and always engaged in resistance and supporting those who are fighting the good fight. We have a campaign at the Urban League. It's the D3 campaign: defend democracy, demand diversity, and defeat poverty. Those are the things that we must consistently stay doing. Right? It's 2026, and we're talking about defending democracy, because if we don't defend it, it will go away. We have to demand diversity because we saw what happened. We had all of these DEI initiatives and programs, and we thought we were good. Some folks thought we were good. Others were like, yeah, nah, that ain't gonna last. And it didn't last. But there are still people, despite the fact that statistics show people overwhelmingly think that DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion in the public sector and the private sector, is a good thing. There are moments in history where people will come into power and say, that's not good, and pit us against one another to say the reason you lack is because of them. And that is the furthest thing from the truth. We have to defeat poverty. The greatest driver of inequality is when people are being exploited. And so when we can address those 3 Ds, we are going to be better as a nation, but it has to be a consistent and persistent ongoing struggle and movement. And so to Carol's point, the fact that we are out here this evening is a testament to the resilience that lies within each one of you. And my hope and prayer is that you tap into the legacy and history of the people of this nation who have resisted and fought against oppression to bring us where we are today, but even further into the future.
Whoa. Whoa. That was epic.
Well, I want to give you all an opportunity, if you have any closing thoughts after the course of this conversation that you want to leave folks with.
So I don't go out in public in 2026 without reminding people that it is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. I have my little 250 lapel pin. You can get it for $3 at the Monticello gift shop, monticello.org. I think it is a time to lean into our common inheritance for all the things that distinguish and divide us, and the Declaration of Independence is one of those. So I say the preamble to myself every morning when I brush my teeth, like singing happy birthday during COVID. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that is y'all. The other thing I do every morning is I ask, how is this my fault? And what can I do differently? So in this anniversary year, I hope we can hold on to the things that make us, as the Declaration claimed, without it yet being so, one people. And I think that will take humility as well as fortitude.
Thank you.
I think I've been reflecting a lot after Reverend Jesse Jackson passed away about, leaders who lead big lives and complicated lives. But one of the things that has always stood out to me is his speech when he says, I am somebody. And I think in this moment when we are facing fascism and political repression, and it seems as though racism is just staring down at all of us. I like to think back to, these Black activists in the 18th century who were also saying, we are somebody, and you should take us seriously. You have a group of sailors in 1783 who Black sailors are going out to sea. It's one of the main ways that Black people are making money for their family. And what's happening is that you have these boats coming into Boston, and people are saying, hey, yeah, come aboard my ship, and you'll go out to sea, you'll make some money, you come back to your family. And then they're not coming home. And so you have these Black men who band together and they say, actually, the Declaration has promised us something. And they're asking the government to stop it, to say, this is not possible. We are afraid to take these jobs. We're being sold to slavery. You actually have to protect us. And, that is an important moment to reflect on, because it shows not only how dangerous it was to exist, but how, these communities were saying, but we're still here, and we demand to walk these streets free from the tyranny of slavery. That is the thing that has been promised to us, and we demand that to be. We demand that you give that to us. And so I think if we look at these moments in history, that we should also feel empowered by them. Because even when people are living under the worst of conditions, they're still showing up. And they're showing up not only for themselves and their families, but also for their community. And the thing that fascism does, it forces us to retreat into our own family units, and we have to actually resist that. We can't get so overwhelmed that we only think about ourselves and we're forgetting about our neighbors. And so I hope that we keep fighting, and more importantly, that if this is a moment where there are no rules, then there are no rules, and we should be our biggest and boldest selves. Beautiful.
So I'm going to end where we began, which was by my sister Amanda Shea, the poet. In her poem, she said, "Freedom is not a finished sentence." And so this notion that we have not yet arrived, but we are arriving, it is a journey, and it is a consistent or a constant struggle. And we show up on behalf of those who have come before us, but also for those who are yet to come. And there's an obligation on us to continue to resist authoritarianism and tyranny and injustice and oppression. And even if it is a nominal act, resistance matters. I think it is also important for us to tell the story, to learn the stories, but to tell the stories. It was through the recording of the African Methodist Episcopal Church's annual conferences that at the 1898 North Georgia annual conference, I found out about the ordination of Reverend Wade H. Mance, who is my great great-grandfather, who I had no idea was an ordained reverend, but there is a documentation of my people's legacy and history. And so it is important for us to tell our stories, whether we do it through a diary, whether we do it through court pleadings, whether we do it in graffiti tags on the sides of buildings or in photographs, or arrest dockets, because we have resisted tyranny through civil disobedience. We've got to resist and we've got to tell the story, because freedom is not a finished sentence.
It's so hard to follow, Rahsaan. I would just say, keep showing up. That's the most important thing. Keep showing up. Learn your history, tell your stories, celebrate the arts, and keep showing up. Because no one can do it all alone. Not one of us can do it alone, but each of us can do something. So show up for your neighbors when they're under attack. Show up at your schools, show up at your legislature, show up here tonight. If you show up, I think the future is bright for all of us, but it won't work unless each of us does our bit. So keep doing your bit like you've done tonight and keep showing up. Thank you.
Okay, so that's the first part of the evening. We're about to transition outside for our exterior projections to see all of your messages. So throughout the evening, you've all had a chance to contribute your thoughts on Boston's legacy of organizing resistance movements and leading the nation towards liberty and equality. Before we transition outside, I have a microphone, so I really want to quickly thank all of you. Thank you so much for your expertise. It's an honor that you're willing to make this happen with me. I want to thank Nikki and Old North Illuminated for being such awesome, and Old North Church for being such awesome, yeah, clap it up. They're super collaborative, generous hosts. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.